A white police officer waved the car over. The luxury vehicle slid to the side of the street, and as the driver rolled down the window, it was possible to feel the weight of something wrong in the air. On the other side of the window, the officer kept his hand steady on the holstered gun. "Car document and identification," he said coldly, without even looking at the man in front of him. The driver, calm although used to this type of situation, handed over his documents without hesitation. The police officer barely looked at the papers and, with what seemed to be hidden satisfaction, he pronounced the sentence, "This car is stolen. Get out of the vehicle now." The phrase hung in the air like an unfounded hate-filled accusation. The driver, surprised, was unable to hide his indignation. He was a respected lawyer, known for his competence and integrity. Everything about him indicated who he was, except one thing, his color. That, in the officer's mind, was all that mattered. A black man behind the wheel of an expensive car could only mean one thing: stolen. The driver's tone was one of disbelief. "This car is mine. Everything is in order. My documents are there." He tried to remain calm, but the irritation was building up, burning slowly like a flame fueled by the racism he already knew so well. The police officer completely ignored his words. "Put your hands on the steering wheel where I can see them," he ordered, now with his hand firmly on the gun, as if expecting some violent reaction. As if the color of the skin of the man in front of him was a trigger for the aggression that he had already prejudged. The driver was silent for a moment, looking around. There were no witnesses at that time, just him and the police officer who treated him like a criminal. Humiliation coursed through his veins, the injustice of being judged by the color of his skin, by the simple fact of existing in that space. He knew something like this could happen, but he never imagined it would happen on that day, in that place, on that street that had led him to achievements so many times. "What do you want me to do?" asked the driver, feeling the weight of contempt in the voice coming from outside. The officer smiled a sarcastic smile, as if he was in complete control of the situation, as if the humiliation he inflicted was part of his job. "I said, get out of the car. You will explain this at the police station. Get out of the car." These words sounded more like a sentence. The driver knew that if he left, the situation could escalate into something worse. One wrong decision could cost him his dignity, his freedom, perhaps even his life. But he also knew that staying there and doing nothing could be even worse. The world around him seemed to pause for a moment, and he felt his blood boil. He wouldn't be treated like that again. He wouldn't be humiliated like that. Slowly, he opened the door and got out of the car, keeping his hands visible, even though he knew he wasn't the threat. The officer saw the threat. At that moment, it was his status, his success, his power in a world where men like him, black and successful, were treated as enemies. "Hands on the hood," ordered the police officer, now with his gun drawn. The driver obeyed, feeling the cold metal against his skin. Humiliation quickly turned to anger, but he maintained control. He knew that whatever came next couldn't be an impulse, couldn't be fueled by the emotion of the moment. He needed to think. He needed to act with the precision that a lawyer of his caliber required. "I didn't steal anything," he said, his voice firm as he looked at the police officer, who now, with more authority, called for reinforcements. And it was there, at that moment, with his hand on the hood and his dignity being torn apart, that he made a decision. What he would do after that approach would change everything. He would no longer be a silent victim. That humiliation, that look from the police officer who saw him as nothing, would be the fuel for a bigger battle. Police backup arrived, and the previously empty street now had patrol cars and lights flashing. But what no one knew was that while everyone was looking at that black man leaning against his car, waiting for him to give in, he was already one step ahead. The power he held was not in physical strength but in knowledge. And, above all, he knew something that the police officer didn't know. Every movement of that approach had been recorded. Every word said was recorded. The decision was made. The humiliation he felt now would become the path to exposing all the rot in that system. What began as a discriminatory approach would soon turn into a legal battle that would take him to court, but this time with full control of the narrative. The question now was, how would he weaponize this injustice? How would he use his experience to not only get revenge but expose all the corruption and racism that hid behind that uniform? What the lawyer did after that approach was shocking, a step that would not only change his life but also open the doors to something much bigger. Terrence Whitmore was never the kind of man to let adversity define his path. At age 45, he had built a stellar career as a defense attorney in Oakland, California. He was known for his ability to turn the tables in court, but his greatest skill was not in his legal knowledge or the eloquence of his words. Terrence's true power came from his resilience, from years of learning to adapt, to survive, and most of all, to win in a system that constantly tried to tear him down. From an early age, he knew that the path to success for a black man like him would be paved with challenges that white men would never understand. Growing up in a poor neighborhood in Oakland, Terrence quickly learned what it was like to live on the margins. Public school was never a safe place, but his mother, Gloria, a strong and determined woman, always told him that education was the only way to a better life. He excelled in his studies, even when teachers seemed to ignore him and his grades were constantly underestimated. Gloria, who worked 2 shifts as a nurse, could barely keep up with the pace of life but always found time to remind Terrence of who he was. "You're more than that," she said as she put dinner on the table. "You won't let this world tell you otherwise." Her words always echoed in his mind. He kept going, fought for a scholarship, and finally got into law school. There, he stood out. But even with all his achievements, he knew that true respect was still far away. Terrence built a solid career defending those like him, who were victims of a system that seemed designed to fail the most vulnerable. His Oakland office, in the heart of the city, was a reflection of his mission, fighting for those without a voice. Now Terrence drove his luxury car, a gift he gave himself after closing a big corporate case, through the streets of a more upscale neighborhood in the city. Even though he was the epitome of the success that many dream of, he knew that, for some, he was just another black man driving an expensive car. No matter how much he had achieved, prejudice was always lurking, waiting for the opportunity to appear. But he was used to it, or thought he was. As the sun set and the orange light illuminated the streets, Terrence made his way home, thinking about the next day's commitments. He had an important meeting with a group of investors, a new opportunity to represent a company that wanted to make its way into the technology market. His mind was completely focused on his next steps when suddenly the blue lights of a siren flashed in the rearview mirror. For a moment, he thought it was a coincidence that the officer was behind another car, but as soon as the light started flashing more insistently, he realized it was him. Sighing, Terrence pulled over. His heart didn't quicken. He had been through this before. Unfortunately, being stopped by the police, even for no reason, was a reality for black men like him. But this time, there was something different, a tension in the air that he couldn't explain. The officer who got out of the police car was tall, with broad shoulders and a look that exuded a mixture of authority and disdain. The name on his uniform said Officer Brad Thompson. Thompson was known in the police force for his aggressive approaches, always feeling that his duty was to command respect, often by force. To him, the color of someone's skin was a clue about their character, and it made him believe that any black person in an expensive car had to be doing something wrong. As the officer approached the car, Terrence kept his hands on the steering wheel in an automatic gesture he had learned many years ago: always avoid any misunderstandings. Thompson looked at him, but what he saw was not a respected, successful lawyer with a life built on sweat and hard work. What Thompson saw was a threat, a black man with a car that, in his mind, he shouldn't be driving. Car documents and driver's license. The officer's voice sounded like an order, not a request. Terrence remained calm, handing over the papers the officer asked for. He knew that arguing at that moment wouldn't help anything. He had learned to pick his battles, and this wasn't one he was willing to start right there on the street. As Thompson reviewed the documents, the tension in the air increased. The silence between them was heavy, as if they both knew something bad was about to happen. And it happened. "This car is stolen, isn't it?" The officer's tone was an accusation, not a question. It was a statement. Thompson, with an expression that mixed satisfaction and coldness, looked directly into Terrence's eyes. "Sorry?" Terrence replied, not believing what he had just heard. "The car is mine. It's all there in the documents." But Thompson didn't seem interested in the truth. His mind was already made up. Terrence was guilty, and nothing he said would change that. "Get out of the car now," Thompson said, his hand resting on the gun strapped to his holster. For a second, Terrence was silent, processing the situation. He knew he was innocent. He knew that accusation was completely baseless. But he also knew how these situations could end badly, especially for black men. What should he do? Argue with the police officer? Resist injustice right there? Or just do what he said and settle it in court, where he knew he had a real chance? Terrence took a deep breath and decided to get out of the car. The humiliation was evident in every move he made. He felt Thompson's judgmental eyes on him, as if his very existence at that moment was a crime. As he walked away from the vehicle, keeping his hands visible, he thought about his mother, about what she would say if she saw what was happening. "You're more than that," she always said. But in that moment, he felt reduced to nothing, a successful black man being treated like a criminal because of his skin. Thompson, now in full control of the situation, approached, analyzing Terrence's every detail, as if waiting for a mistake, for a justification to use force. "Hands on the hood," ordered the police officer. Terrence obeyed, placing his hands on the cold metal of the car, the sound of sirens still echoing around him. The asphalt beneath his feet seemed to shake with the accumulated tension. But in that moment, he knew that approach, that public humiliation, would not end there. He wouldn't let it end there. His power was not in the physical but in what he carried within himself, the knowledge, the ability to transform a situation like that into something greater. The indignation that grew inside him was not just for himself but for all black men who had ever gone through something like this. And at that moment, as his hands touched the hood, he made a decision. That injustice would not end there. Terrence felt the cold metal of the hood beneath his hands, but what bothered him most was Officer Thompson's penetrating gaze, which seemed to savor every second of this humiliation. It wasn't the first time he'd faced something like this, but there was something about the way Thompson treated him, an almost arrogant conviction that he was beyond challenge, that made his blood boil. "Tell me something, officer," Terrence broke the silence, his voice controlled but filled with contained indignation. "What exactly makes you believe this car is stolen?" Thompson, who was already analyzing the situation as if he were preparing a crime scene, gave a dismissive look, as if the question didn't even deserve an answer. "I don't need to explain anything to you," replied the policeman, his voice hard. "Men like you, driving a car like that, you think I don't know the type?" Terrence took a deep breath, fighting to maintain control. He knew where this could end if he lost his cool. Anger simmered beneath the surface, but his self-control was a skill he had developed from a young age, ever since he saw his best friend being unjustly arrested for being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong skin color. "Men like me?" Terrence repeated, looking up to meet Thompson's eyes. "You stopped me because I'm black. Is that it?" Thompson shrugged, ignoring the accusation. "I'm doing my job. Now stay silent and wait for reinforcements to arrive." Terrence bit his lower lip. He knew there was no point in arguing. He knew that, at that moment, on that corner, Thompson was in control. But the power the police officer believed he had wouldn't last forever, and Terrence knew it too. As they waited for other officers to arrive, time seemed to stretch out, each second weighing on Terrence's shoulders like an eternity. He tried to control his breathing, feeling his anger rising, but he also remembered an inescapable truth: his true strength lay in the law. Thompson didn't know who he was dealing with, but he would soon find out. He was a master strategist, both in the courtroom and on the streets, and this situation, no matter how humiliating it was, would be reversed in his favor. Terrence glanced at his cell phone in his pocket, considering his options. He was recording everything mentally, every word, every gesture, but he needed more solid proof. Thompson did not yet know that the car was equipped with internal cameras, and every second of that approach was being recorded. An almost imperceptible smile appeared on his lips. Thompson was giving him the tools for his own undoing without even realizing it. When backup arrived, two other officers got out of their vehicles and walked toward the scene. One of them, Sergeant Williams, a middle-aged man with a neutral expression, took a quick look at the situation before approaching. "What's going on here?" Williams asked, watching Terrence leaning against the car. Thompson was quick to respond, his tone full of false conviction. "I caught this guy here driving a car that clearly isn't his. I bet it's stolen." Williams gave Terrence a long look, but something in his expression changed as he took in the situation further. He didn't seem as assured as Thompson. Unlike his colleague, Williams was an experienced man and could recognize when things didn't add up. "Did you check the documents?" Williams asked, looking at Thompson, who hesitated before answering. "Yes, but I've seen this guy before." "He could have faked everything," Thompson replied with a confidence that now sounded forced. Terrence, until then silent, decided it was time to intervene. "Officer Williams, I have all my documents in order, and I have cameras in the car that recorded this entire approach from the beginning. I suggest you review the facts before jumping to conclusions," he said, his voice firm but still carrying a forced calm. Williams, surprised, looked at Terrence more closely. It wasn't common for someone in a situation like that to have so much confidence. He exchanged a quick glance with Thompson, who now looked less sure of himself. "Cameras," repeated Williams, raising an eyebrow. "Yes. Internal cameras. The entire conversation between me and Officer Thompson is recorded, and I'm sure that if you review the recordings, you can see that I was stopped for no reason at all," Terrence added, now with a more decisive tone. Thompson stepped forward, interrupting. "Don't fall for it, Williams. He's making it up to escape. These kinds of people always do this." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with tension. Williams looked from one to the other, assessing the situation. He knew that any wrong move now could have major repercussions, and unlike Thompson, he seemed to understand that he was dealing with something bigger than a simple police stop. "Let me check those cameras then," Williams said, his tone calm but firm. "If you're telling the truth, we can resolve this quickly." Terrence nodded, keeping his gaze fixed on Thompson, who now looked uneasy. The police officer, who moments before exuded confidence, began to realize that his authority was at stake and that perhaps he was losing control of the narrative. Terrence activated the car's camera system and showed the recording to Williams. The sergeant watched in silence as the moments of the approach unfolded on the screen, and his expression, initially neutral, became increasingly serious. Thompson's words echoed through the audio, the contempt, the unfair accusation. "This is unacceptable," Williams muttered to himself as he finished watching. Terrence, still standing next to the car, maintained control. This was no time for early celebrations. He knew this was just the first step. Thompson, on the other hand, was beginning to realize that the situation was getting out of his control, and the anger on his face was now giving way to something closer to fear. Williams turned off the recording and looked at Terrence with a serious expression. "Mr. Whitmore, it appears there has been a serious error here," he began, his words chosen carefully. "Let's resolve this right now." Terrence kept his gaze fixed on Thompson, who could no longer hide his irritation and discomfort. It was clear he knew his career was at risk. But what he didn't know yet was that small victory was just the beginning. The lawyer had more cards to play, and the real impact would come next. Thompson had no idea he was about to face a much bigger battle than he had ever imagined. As Williams organized Terrence's release and the end of the raid, the air was thick with the tension of something unresolved. The situation was still far from over, and what came next would be devastating for Thompson and the system he represented. Terrence calmly got back into his car, but before leaving, he threw one last sentence at the officer who had humiliated him: "We'll see you soon. And this time, it won't be here on the street." He started the car, feeling the weight of impending revenge growing inside him. The next move would be his, and Thompson would discover that true power lay not in the streets but in the courts. Terrence sat at his desk in his office, his face illuminated only by the light from his computer screen. The sound of Oakland traffic echoed in the streets below, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused on a single goal: justice, not just for himself, but for all those who, like him, had been silenced by the brutality and prejudice embedded in the system. Ever since that night when Officer Thompson stopped and humiliated him, Terrence knew he couldn't let it go. The recording of the approach had been a gift. Every hateful word, every action driven by prejudice, had been captured by the car's cameras. But that was just the beginning. Terrence knew Thompson wasn't an isolated case. he was a symptom of a larger problem. And now, Terrence had the tools he needed to dismantle it. As he typed on his computer, preparing the court case, he recalled the conversation he had with Sergeant Williams that night. "Mr. Whitmore," Williams began, his expression tired, as though he already knew this wouldn't end well for the department. "We will investigate this case, I promise." Officer Thompson's behavior was inappropriate. Terrence, still holding his anger inside, nodded. "This won't just be about his behavior, Sergeant. This is going to be about the entire system, about how men like Thompson feel comfortable acting this way because they know, in the end, they'll get away with it," he said, his voice calm yet filled with a certainty that victory was inevitable. Days later, Terrence was ready to take the first step. He had gathered evidence from other cases, victims who had also suffered at the hands of Thompson and other officers like him. The web of abuse was much more intricate than he'd imagined. Thompson was just one thread in a skein of injustice. Terrence knew the best way to attack wasn't individually but collectively. He didn't just want to sue Thompson, he wanted to sue the entire department. He wanted all eyes on what was happening on the streets of Oakland. With the case ready, he closed his laptop and stood up, taking a deep breath. The next step was to go to court and present his case. He knew it would be a long and difficult war, the system was tough, but Terrence was tougher. That same night, Terrence called his old friend and college classmate, Malcolm Johnson, a renowned civil rights lawyer. Malcolm had worked on similar cases and knew how to navigate the bureaucracy of the legal system. Terrence needed an ally, someone who knew the ins and outs of the courts as much as he did. "Malcolm, I need you," Terrence said, getting straight to the point. "I was already expecting this call," Malcolm replied with a light laugh on the other end of the line. "Tell me everything." Terrence explained in detail everything that had happened, from the approach to the evidence he had gathered. Malcolm listened in silence, taking in every word. When Terrence finished, there was a pause before Malcolm spoke again. "This case has great potential, Terrence. Not just to take down Thompson, but to expose the entire corrupt system that protects guys like him. This won't be easy. You know that, right?" "I know," Terrence replied, his voice filled with conviction. "But it needs to be done. I won't allow another black man to be humiliated the way I was." "I'm with you," Malcolm said. "Let's go after them." The next morning, Terrence and Malcolm entered the courthouse. The building, with its imposing marble columns, seemed as cold and impersonal as the very judicial system they were about to confront. Outside, a small crowd of supporters had already formed. News of the lawsuit had spread quickly, and Terrence's name was making headlines in local newspapers. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. On the opposite side were Thompson and the police department's lawyers, their expressions a mix of confidence and arrogance. They believed that, like so many other times, they would get away with it. But Terrence was about to show them this time would be different. The first hearing was marked by damning testimony. Terrence played recordings of the approach, and every word Thompson said that night echoed in the room. The judge, initially passive, seemed to gradually grasp the gravity of what was being shown. The silence in the room was interrupted only by the sound of the recordings. Thompson's face lost its color with each passing second. After the evidence was presented, the department's lawyers tried to downplay the seriousness of the situation, arguing that Thompson had acted within protocol. But Terrence was ready for that. "If the protocol allows this kind of abuse of power," he said, his voice firm but controlled, "then the protocol needs to be changed. Officer Thompson didn't just humiliate me, he abused his authority. And what's worse, this behavior has been tolerated and even encouraged by a system that fails to protect the citizens it is sworn to serve." The judge, listening to Terrence's words, leaned forward slightly, attentive. He knew this case wasn't just about an unfair approach, it was about something much bigger. When the first day in court ended, Thompson and his lawyers hurried out without even looking at Terrence. Outside, the crowd had grown. People cheered for Terrence and Malcolm as they walked down the courthouse steps. But Terrence knew that was just the beginning. The battle was still far from won. "They're going to fight back," Malcolm said as they walked to the car. "And they'll try to destroy you in the process." Terrence nodded, already expecting the worst. I'm ready. They can try whatever they want, but I'm going to see this through to the end. In the days that followed, the courtroom became a battleground. The defense attorneys for the police department launched a campaign to discredit Terrence, digging into his past and presenting witnesses who would attempt to tarnish his reputation. They scrutinized his personal and professional life, searching for anything that could shift the focus away from the systemic abuse he aimed to expose. One Thursday morning, Malcolm called Terrence with an update. "They're bringing in witnesses against you," Malcolm said, his voice tense. "They're trying to turn this into a personal attack. They want to take you down before the case gains more momentum." "What witnesses?" Terrence asked, already anticipating their tactics. "They're bringing in an old client of yours, someone you defended years ago. They're going to claim negligence, trying to paint you as a flawed lawyer." Terrence sighed, rubbing his temples. That case was resolved years ago. "They're desperate." "They are," Malcolm agreed. "But that doesn't mean they can't wreak havoc in the process. You need to be prepared." Terrence's preparation was meticulous. He anticipated every argument, countering each attempt to discredit him with calm and precision. For every accusation, he provided evidence; for every claim, he had a rebuttal. The courtroom witnessed a masterclass in legal strategy as Terrence and Malcolm worked to keep the case's focus on the systemic issues rather than personal smears. Meanwhile, Officer Thompson's demeanor shifted dramatically. The confidence he had displayed in the early hearings faded, replaced by visible anxiety. He sat at the defense table, increasingly restless, as if the walls were closing in. He knew the evidence against him was mounting, and there was no escape from the consequences of his actions. At the final hearing, the atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. Terrence stood to deliver his closing statement, addressing the judge, the defense, and everyone in attendance. "This case isn't just about me," he began, his voice steady and resonant. "It's not just about what happened that night in Oakland. It's about a system that repeatedly fails to protect the people who need protection the most, a system that allows men like Officer Thompson to abuse their power while those who should be protected are treated like criminals." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in before continuing. "What I want here today is not just justice for myself. I want justice for every person who has ever gone through something like this, for every man, woman, and child who has been silenced, humiliated, treated as less because of the color of their skin." Terrence turned to face Thompson directly. "What you did that night wasn't just an unfair approach. It was a reflection of something much bigger. But today, it ends here." The silence in the courtroom was palpable as Terrence returned to his seat. All eyes were on the judge, whose stern expression betrayed the weight of the decision he was about to deliver. Adjusting his glasses, the judge cleared his throat and began. "After analyzing all the evidence presented and listening carefully to the testimony of both parties," he said, his voice firm and deliberate, "this court reaches the conclusion that Officer Brad Thompson is guilty of abuse of authority, racial discrimination, and misconduct in the exercise of his duties." The tension in the room peaked as the judge continued. "Considering the gravity of the defendant's actions and the impact his abuse had on the lives of Mr. Whitmore and other victims, this court orders that Officer Thompson will serve a sentence of 7 years in prison." The verdict hit the room like a thunderclap. Murmurs rippled through the audience as Thompson's face turned pale. His once arrogant demeanor dissolved into panic. He looked to his lawyers for support, but they remained silent, acknowledging their defeat. The judge banged the gavel, declaring, "Case closed." As the crowd outside the courthouse erupted in cheers, Terrence walked down the steps alongside Malcolm. The victory was monumental, but Terrence knew it was only the beginning. "They'll retaliate," Malcolm said as they approached the car. "This isn't over." "I know," Terrence replied, his resolve unshaken. "But it's a start." The aftermath of the verdict was seismic. News of Officer Thompson's 7-year sentence dominated local and national headlines. What had initially seemed like just another case of police misconduct became a historic moment, a symbol of accountability in a system long perceived as untouchable. For Terrence, the victory was bittersweet. While Thompson's conviction was a step forward, it was clear that the systemic issues ran much deeper. The Oakland Police Department launched an internal review under public pressure, leading to the dismissal of several high-ranking officials. Investigations revealed a culture of complicity and corruption that had enabled officers like Thompson to act with impunity. Terrence's personal life, however, was under constant scrutiny. The department's lawyers, along with those benefiting from the current system, intensified their efforts to discredit him. Articles appeared questioning his motives, dredging up old cases, and painting him as an opportunist rather than a crusader for justice. The backlash was relentless. One afternoon, Malcolm visited Terrence unannounced, bringing with him a sense of urgency. Sitting across from his friend in the office, he got straight to the point. "They're not stopping," Malcolm said. "The department and their allies are working overtime to undermine you. They're planting doubts about your integrity, trying to shift the narrative." Terrence nodded, already aware of the efforts to derail him. "I expected this," he said, his voice steady. "If they can't win in the courtroom, they'll fight me in the public eye." Malcolm leaned forward, his tone growing serious. "This is bigger than Thompson now. The more you expose, the more powerful enemies you'll make. Are you ready for what comes next?" Terrence met his friend's gaze. "I didn't start this to quit halfway. If they want to fight dirty, I'll keep playing fair. The truth is on our side, and that's what will prevail." In the weeks that followed, Terrence intensified his fight, delving deeper into the system that had enabled Thompson and others like him. He began uncovering additional cases of abuse, revealing a disturbing pattern that stretched far beyond a single officer. Names of other complicit officers surfaced, alongside evidence of systemic corruption within the Oakland Police Department. Each discovery added to the growing pressure on the department and its leadership. But as Terrence's case gained momentum, so did the threats against him. Anonymous messages warned him to back down. His office was vandalized, and his family received intimidating phone calls. Despite this, Terrence's resolve only strengthened. He knew the stakes were high, but the potential for meaningful change kept him focused. Amid the turmoil, an unexpected ally emerged. Sergeant Williams, the officer who had been present during Thompson's stop of Terrence, reached out. In a confidential meeting at a quiet cafe, Williams spoke with a nervous urgency. "I need to talk to you," Williams began, his voice low. "What happened to Thompson? That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's more, much more, and I can't stay silent anymore." Terrence raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "I'm listening." Williams took a deep breath before continuing. "Thompson didn't act alone. Many of us knew what was happening, but we were told to ignore it or worse, to cover it up. There are superiors involved, people protecting these officers. It's a network, bigger than you can imagine." Terrence leaned back, the weight of Williams's words settling over him. The corruption Williams described confirmed what Terrence had suspected but hadn't yet been able to prove. "Do you have evidence?" Terrence asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Williams nodded. "I've kept records, documents, emails, even some recordings. But if they find out I'm talking to you, my career, my life, it's all at risk." Terrence knew the risks were significant. Exposing a system as deeply entrenched as this one would invite retaliation not only against him but against anyone willing to stand with him. Still, he saw an opportunity to bring about real change. "If you're willing to come forward with this, I'll make sure you're protected," Terrence promised. "But we have to be smart about how we proceed." The information Williams provided was explosive. It outlined a pattern of abuse and cover-ups involving high-ranking officers and a systemic effort to shield corrupt practices from scrutiny. Armed with this new evidence, Terrence began building a broader case, one that targeted the department as a whole. To ensure the safety of Williams and others who might come forward, Terrence decided the best course of action was to make the evidence public. He called for a press conference, during which he and Williams presented their findings. The documents, recordings, and testimonies painted a damning picture of a police department riddled with corruption and complicity. The response was immediate. The mayor of Oakland announced an independent investigation into the police department. Public outrage grew as the extent of the corruption became clear. Within days, several high-ranking officials were placed on administrative leave, and some resigned under pressure. While the city reeled from the revelations, Terrence became a national figure. Media outlets hailed him as a champion of justice, and civil rights organizations rallied behind him. His work brought attention to broader issues of systemic racism and abuse of power, sparking conversations across the country about police reform. Despite the praise, Terrence remained focused. He knew the fight was far from over. The system that had protected officers like Thompson wouldn't be dismantled easily, and there were still powerful forces working against him. Malcolm, ever the realist, reminded him of the challenges ahead. "You've done something incredible, Terrence," Malcolm said during one of their late-night strategy meetings. "But they're not going to let this slide. The more you push, the harder they'll push back." "I'm ready for whatever comes," Terrence replied. "We've come too far to stop now." The weeks turned into months as the investigation unfolded. The internal review uncovered decades of misconduct, leading to the dismissal of more officers and the restructuring of the department. Sergeant Williams, despite the risks he had taken, found new purpose as a consultant for reform efforts, helping to rebuild trust between the police and the community. Thompson, meanwhile, began serving his sentence. Isolated and discredited, he became a symbol of accountability in a system that had long resisted it. His downfall sent a clear message to others: abuse of power would no longer go unchecked. Terrence, though victorious, declined offers to enter politics or take on high-profile roles in national reform efforts. Instead, he returned to his work as a lawyer, using his newfound platform to advocate for others who had suffered under unjust systems. Each case he took on became an opportunity to continue the fight for justice, one client at a time. The impact of Terrence's work extended far beyond Oakland. His story inspired countless others to stand up against injustice, proving that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged. For Terrence, the journey was never about revenge, it was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what he had experienced. As he walked the streets of Oakland, he felt the weight of both victory and responsibility. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, the tide had turned. Justice, long elusive, was finally within reach. In the aftermath of the public revelations, the movement Terrence had sparked began to take on a life of its own. Community leaders, activists, and citizens began organizing town halls and discussions about systemic racism, police reform, and the broader implications of unchecked power. Terrence found himself at the center of these conversations, his voice becoming a rallying cry for change. Despite the public support, the backlash intensified. Those who had benefited from the corrupt system fought back with smear campaigns, attempting to tarnish his reputation. They dredged up every detail of his life, hoping to find cracks in his armor. The threats became more direct, but Terrence, bolstered by Malcolm and a growing network of allies, refused to back down. One day, as he prepared for yet another meeting with reform advocates, Malcolm walked into his office holding a newspaper. The headline read, "Reform Hero Faces Retaliation from Oakland Power Players." "They're trying to paint you as a radical," Malcolm said, tossing the paper onto the desk. "They're claiming you're destabilizing the city, putting public safety at risk." Terrence glanced at the article, his expression calm but determined. "Let them say what they want," he said. "Their fear is a sign that we're making progress." Malcolm smirked, his admiration evident. "I don't know how you stay so composed. They're throwing everything at you." "It's not about me," Terrence replied. "It's about the people who've suffered in silence for too long. If I crumble, their stories get buried again." As the pressure mounted, Terrence continued to work tirelessly. His next major initiative was to establish a coalition of legal experts and activists to draft proposals for comprehensive police reform. The coalition's goals included mandatory body cameras for all officers, independent oversight committees, and de-escalation training programs. The proposals were met with resistance from some quarters, but they also garnered widespread support from the public. Meanwhile, Sergeant Williams's role as a whistleblower became increasingly significant. He provided invaluable insight into the inner workings of the department, helping to identify patterns of misconduct and the individuals responsible. His courage inspired other officers to come forward, further unraveling the web of corruption. One of these officers, a young recruit named Officer Elena Martinez, shared her experiences of being pressured to stay silent about misconduct she had witnessed. Her testimony added another layer of credibility to Terrence's case, demonstrating that the problem wasn't limited to a few rogue officers but was systemic in nature. During one particularly heated press conference, a reporter asked Terrence if he felt the weight of the opposition was too much to bear. "Change is never easy," Terrence said. "When you challenge power, power pushes back. But the truth is stronger than any smear campaign, any threat, any attempt to silence us. The truth will win." As the weeks turned into months, the reforms began to take shape. The Oakland Police Department was placed under federal oversight, ensuring that the changes Terrence and his allies had fought for would be implemented. Community policing programs were introduced, fostering trust between officers and residents. The department also created a civilian review board with the authority to investigate complaints of misconduct. For Terrence, these victories were a testament to what could be achieved when people refused to accept injustice as the norm. Yet, he remained acutely aware of the work that still needed to be done. Every victory was a step forward, but the fight against systemic racism and abuse of power was far from over. One evening, as he sat in his office reviewing documents, Terrence received a call from Sergeant Williams. "I wanted to thank you," Williams said. "Not just for what you've done for the city, but for helping me find my voice. For a long time, I thought staying silent was the only way to survive. You showed me that speaking out is the only way to truly live." Terrence leaned back in his chair, a rare smile crossing his face. "You're the one who took the risk, Williams. You made this possible." "Maybe," Williams replied. "But I wouldn't have done it without you leading the way." The call ended, leaving Terrence with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in a long time. The journey had been grueling, but moments like this reminded him why he had chosen to fight. Over time, the changes in Oakland began to ripple outward. Other cities took notice, adopting similar reforms and scrutinizing their own police departments. What started as a single act of defiance on a quiet street had grown into a nationwide movement. For Terrence, the fight never truly ended. He continued to take on cases that exposed injustice, using his platform to amplify the voices of the unheard. His name became synonymous with resilience, his story a symbol of what could be achieved when courage met determination. As he walked through the streets of Oakland, he often reflected on how far they had come. The city was far from perfect, but it was better, more just, more accountable. And for Terrence, that was enough to keep him going. The legacy he built wasn't just about one case, one officer, or one city. It was about proving that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It was about showing that justice wasn't just an abstract ideal but a goal worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Months turned into years, and the changes Terrence had fought for began to solidify. The city of Oakland became a model for police reform, inspiring similar efforts across the nation. Civil rights groups often invited Terrence to speak, his story becoming a powerful reminder that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged and reformed. Terrence, however, chose to stay grounded. He declined offers to run for public office or accept high-profile positions in advocacy organizations. Instead, he focused on what he did best, fighting for justice one case at a time. His law firm grew, attracting lawyers who shared his passion for civil rights and systemic change. Together, they took on cases that exposed corruption, defended the vulnerable, and held powerful institutions accountable. Despite his victories, Terrence remained a target for those who resisted change. He received regular threats, and smear campaigns continued to surface sporadically. But by then, his reputation was unshakable. The community he served rallied around him, and the growing network of supporters across the nation made it clear that any attack on him was an attack on the cause he represented. One evening, as Terrence reviewed a new case file, Malcolm walked into his office. "You've been at it non-stop," Malcolm said, dropping a folder on the desk. "You might want to slow down before you burn out." Terrence looked up and smirked. "You know me better than that." "I do, which is why I'm here," Malcolm replied, pulling up a chair. "This is big. A class action lawsuit against a private prison corporation accused of exploiting inmates for profit. It's right up your alley." Terrence opened the folder and skimmed through the details. The allegations were appalling: prisoners forced to work under inhumane conditions for little to no pay while the corporation raked in millions. It was yet another example of a system that preyed on the vulnerable. This could be huge, Terrence said, his mind already racing with strategies. If we win, it could set a precedent for reforming the entire private prison industry. Malcolm nodded. Exactly. But it's going to be a battle. These corporations have deep pockets and a lot of influence. That's never stopped us before, Terrence said with a determined grin. The case quickly became one of the most challenging of Terrence's career. The corporation spared no expense in its defense, employing a team of high-powered lawyers and launching a public relations campaign to discredit the lawsuit. But Terrence and his team were relentless. They uncovered damning evidence of abuse, including internal documents that revealed the corporation's deliberate cost-cutting measures at the expense of inmates' safety and dignity. The trial was grueling, lasting nearly a year. Witnesses testified about the horrifying conditions they endured, while the corporation's lawyers tried to deflect blame and paint the inmates as untrustworthy. But Terrence's meticulous preparation and unwavering commitment to justice shone through. In the end, the jury delivered a landmark verdict. The corporation was found guilty of numerous violations, including human rights abuses and labor exploitation. The settlement was one of the largest in U.S. history, and the case prompted sweeping reforms in the private prison industry. The victory further cemented Terrence's legacy, but he remained humble. "This isn't about me," he said during a press conference after the verdict. "This is about holding those in power accountable and ensuring that no one is treated as less than human." As the years went on, Terrence continued to fight for justice, but he also began mentoring a new generation of lawyers and activists. He believed that lasting change required passing the torch, empowering others to carry on the work he had started. His law firm became a training ground for young attorneys passionate about civil rights and systemic reform. One of his men's, a young woman named Alana Hayes, stood out. She had grown up in Oakland, inspired by Terrence's story, and joined his firm straight out of law school. Under his guidance, she quickly became a force to be reckoned with, taking on cases that challenged entrenched systems of inequality. During a meeting one day, Alana turned to Terrence. "You know, you've created something incredible here. But don't you ever think about stepping back, letting the rest of us take over?" Terrence chuckled. "I think about it sometimes. But there's still so much work to be done." "There always will be," Alana said with a smile. "But you've shown us how to fight. Maybe it's time for you to rest a little." Terrence looked at her, a mixture of pride and nostalgia in his eyes. "You might be right," he admitted. "But I'm not quite ready to hang up my gloves just yet." In the years that followed, Terrence gradually shifted his focus, taking on fewer cases and spending more time mentoring and advocating for policy changes. His impact extended far beyond the courtroom, as the reforms he championed continued to reshape institutions and inspire movements nationwide. By the time he finally decided to retire, Terrence had become a living legend. His name was synonymous with courage, justice, and resilience. But for him, the true measure of success wasn't in the accolades or the headlines, it was in the lives he had touched, the systems he had helped change, and the legacy he left behind. As he walked away from his office for the last time, Terrence felt a sense of peace. The fight for justice would continue, carried on by those he had mentored and inspired. And as he stepped into the next chapter of his life, he knew that the seeds he had planted would continue to grow, ensuring that the pursuit of justice would never falter. Even in retirement, Terrence Whitmore remained a symbol of hope and progress. Though he no longer took on active cases, his influence extended through the countless lawyers, activists, and leaders he had mentored. Invitations to speak at universities, conferences, and public forums filled his schedule, each event offering an opportunity to reflect on the battles he had fought and the victories he had achieved. One such event was at the University of California, Berkeley, where a crowd of students eagerly awaited his keynote address. Standing at the podium, Terrence looked out over the sea of young faces, reminded of his own journey and the challenges he had overcome. "Justice," he began, his voice steady and resonant, "is not a destination. It's a journey, a path that requires courage, resilience, and an unwavering belief in what's right. Each of you has the power to make a difference, to challenge injustice, and to build a better world. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The room erupted in applause, the energy palpable. Terrence's words resonated deeply, inspiring a new generation to take up the mantle of justice. Back in Oakland, the city he had dedicated his life to improving, the impact of his work was visible everywhere. Community programs flourished, bridging the gap between residents and law enforcement. The reforms he had fought for became part of the city's identity, a testament to what could be achieved when people united for a common cause. One afternoon, while walking through a neighborhood park, Terrence encountered a group of children playing basketball. Nearby, a young boy sat on a bench, watching the game intently but too shy to join in. Terrence approached and sat down beside him. "Why aren't you out there playing?" Terrence asked, his tone gentle. The boy shrugged. "I'm not good enough." Terrence smiled, recalling his own struggles with self-doubt as a child. "You know, I used to think the same thing about a lot of things. But I learned that you don't have to be perfect to try. You just have to be willing to take the first step." The boy looked up at him, curiosity replacing hesitation. "You really think I can?" "I know you can," Terrence said. "But you won't find out until you get out there and try." The boy hesitated for a moment before nodding and running onto the court. Watching him join the game, Terrence felt a familiar sense of fulfillment. Even in small moments like this, he knew the seeds of change were being sown. As the years went by, Terrence continued to find ways to give back to the community. He established scholarships for underprivileged students, ensuring that financial barriers wouldn't prevent others from pursuing their dreams. He also partnered with local organizations to create mentorship programs, connecting young people with role models who could guide them through the challenges of life. One day, as he attended the grand opening of a new community center bearing his name, Terrence found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The center, located in the heart of Oakland, was a vibrant space filled with classrooms, art studios, and recreational facilities, a beacon of opportunity for generations to come. During the ceremony, Alana Hayes, now a prominent civil rights lawyer in her own right, spoke about Terrence's enduring legacy. "Terrence Whitmore taught us that justice is a collective effort," she said, addressing the crowd. "He showed us that one person's courage can inspire a movement, and that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change is possible. This center is more than a building, it's a testament to his belief in the power of community." When it was Terrence's turn to speak, he kept his words simple. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "It's about all of us, what we've achieved together and what we'll continue to achieve. The fight for justice never ends, but as long as we stand together, we'll keep moving forward." The applause that followed was deafening, a reflection of the profound impact he had made on so many lives. In his later years, Terrence spent more time with his family, cherishing the moments he had often missed during the height of his career. His grandchildren, curious about his life's work, would sit at his feet, wide-eyed, as he recounted stories of the cases he had fought and the people he had helped. "What made you keep going, Grandpa?" one of them asked one evening. Terrence smiled, his eyes twinkling with warmth. "Because I knew it mattered. Every fight, every step forward, it all mattered. And I wanted to leave the world a little better than I found it." As the sun set on Terrence's remarkable life, his legacy endured. The changes he had championed continued to shape the future, a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could spark revolutions. And though he was no longer on the front lines, his spirit lived on in the countless lives he had touched and the movement he had inspired. The man who once stood alone on a quiet street, defying injustice, had become a symbol of hope for generations. And as his story continued to be told, it served as a powerful reminder that the fight for justice is never in vain. Even in retirement, Terrence Whitmore remained a symbol of hope and progress. Though he no longer took on active cases, his influence extended through the countless lawyers, activists, and leaders he had mentored. Invitations to speak at universities, conferences, and public forums filled his schedule, each event offering an opportunity to reflect on the battles he had fought and the victories he had achieved. One such event was at the University of California, Berkeley, where a crowd of students eagerly awaited his keynote address. Standing at the podium, Terrence looked out over the sea of young faces, reminded of his own journey and the challenges he had overcome. Justice, he began, his voice steady and resonant, is not a destination. It's a journey, a path that requires courage, resilience, and an unwavering belief in what's right. Each of you has the power to make a difference, to challenge injustice, and to build a better world. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The room erupted in applause, the energy palpable. Terrence's words resonated deeply, inspiring a new generation to take up the mantle of justice. Back in Oakland, the city he had dedicated his life to improving, the impact of his work was visible everywhere. Community programs flourished, bridging the gap between residents and law enforcement. The reforms he had fought for became part of the city's identity, a testament to what could be achieved when people united for a common cause. One afternoon, while walking through a neighborhood park, Terrence encountered a group of children playing basketball. Nearby, a young boy sat on a bench, watching the game intently but too shy to join in. Terrence approached and sat down beside him. "Why aren't you out there playing?" Terrence asked, his tone gentle. The boy shrugged. "I'm not good enough." Terrence smiled, recalling his own struggles with self-doubt as a child. "You know, I used to think the same thing about a lot of things. But I learned that you don't have to be perfect to try. You just have to be willing to take the first step." The boy looked up at him, curiosity replacing hesitation. "You really think I can?" "I know you can," Terrence said. "But you won't find out until you get out there and try." The boy hesitated for a moment before nodding and running onto the court. Watching him join the game, Terrence felt a familiar sense of fulfillment. Even in small moments like this, he knew the seeds of change were being sown. As the years went by, Terrence continued to find ways to give back to the community. He established scholarships for underprivileged students, ensuring that financial barriers wouldn't prevent others from pursuing their dreams. He also partnered with local organizations to create mentorship programs, connecting young people with role models who could guide them through the challenges of life. One day, as he attended the grand opening of a new community center bearing his name, Terrence found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The center, located in the heart of Oakland, was a vibrant space filled with classrooms, art studios, and recreational facilities, a beacon of opportunity for generations to come. During the ceremony, Alana Hayes, now a prominent civil rights lawyer in her own right, spoke about Terrence's enduring legacy. "Terrence Whitmore taught us that justice is a collective effort," she said, addressing the crowd. "He showed us that one person's courage can inspire a movement, and that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change is possible." This center is more than a building, it's a testament to his belief in the power of community. When it was Terrence's turn to speak, he kept his words simple. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "It's about all of us, what we've achieved together and what we'll continue to achieve. The fight for justice never ends, but as long as we stand together, we'll keep moving forward." The applause that followed was deafening, a reflection of the profound impact he had made on so many lives. In his later years, Terrence spent more time with his family, cherishing the moments he had often missed during the height of his career. His grandchildren, curious about his life's work, would sit at his feet, wide-eyed, as he recounted stories of the cases he had fought and the people he had helped. "What made you keep going, Grandpa?" one of them asked one evening. Terrence smiled, his eyes twinkling with warmth. "Because I knew it mattered. Every fight, every step forward, it all mattered. And I wanted to leave the world a little better than I found it." As the sun set on Terrence's remarkable life, his legacy endured. The changes he had championed continued to shape the future, a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could spark revolutions. And though he was no longer on the front lines, his spirit lived on in the countless lives he had touched and the movement he had inspired. The man who once stood alone on a quiet street, defying injustice, had become a symbol of hope for generations. And as his story continued to be told, it served as a powerful reminder that the fight for justice is never in vain. Years after Terrence Whitmore's passing, his influence remained deeply woven into the fabric of Oakland and beyond. Schools taught his story as part of their history curriculum, not just as an account of a man who fought for justice but as an example of the power of resilience and collective action. The community center bearing his name had become a hub of activism and opportunity. Young people gathered there to learn, grow, and dream bigger than the limits often imposed on them by society. It wasn't uncommon for visitors to see murals of Terence lining the walls. Vivid, colorful depictions of his journey and the battles he fought. Among the programs flourishing in the center was a legal mentorship initiative, spearheaded by Alana Hayes. The program trained aspiring lawyers from marginalized backgrounds, equipping them with the tools to challenge injustice and dismantle oppressive systems. Every year, the program held a ceremony to celebrate its graduates, and each ceremony began with a moment of silence for Terence, the man who had inspired its creation. Alana often reflected on her mentor's influence during these ceremonies. Standing before each new class of graduates, she would remind them, "You are the torchbearers. Terence fought to open doors, but it's your job to keep them open and make sure more doors are created. Justice is a continuous effort, and now it's your turn to carry that legacy forward." The ripple effects of Terence's work extended far beyond the city. Across the nation, legal firms, nonprofits, and grassroots organizations cited his story as a cornerstone of their own missions. Policies influenced by his advocacy became benchmarks for reform in cities grappling with similar issues of systemic inequality and police misconduct. One particularly impactful legacy was the National Accountability Act, a sweeping piece of legislation inspired by Terence's work. Championed by a coalition of civil rights groups and lawmakers, the act mandated federal oversight of police departments with histories of systemic abuse, introduced universal standards for use of force protocols, and established independent civilian review boards across the country. It was hailed as a historic step toward equity and justice, and Terence's name was mentioned often during its passage. As the years went by, a tradition developed in Oakland, an annual Day of Justice held on the anniversary of Terence's landmark court victory. The event brought together people from all walks of life to celebrate progress and recommit to the work still to be done. Speakers shared stories of resilience, artists performed pieces inspired by Terence's life, and the community renewed its dedication to the fight for equality. One particularly memorable Day of Justice featured a young activist named Marcus, who had been mentored through the community center's programs. Standing before a crowd of thousands, he spoke passionately about how Terence's story had shaped his path. "I used to think that people like me didn't have a voice," Marcus said, his voice trembling with emotion. "But Terence taught us that our voices are our most powerful tool. He showed us that even when the system seems impossible to fight, we can push back. And I'm here because of him, because he believed in people like me." The crowd erupted in applause, and Marcus's words were shared widely on social media, inspiring countless others to take action in their own communities. As the movement Terence had ignited continued to grow, so did his legend. Writers and filmmakers began exploring his story, producing books, documentaries, and films that captured the essence of his journey. One critically acclaimed biopic, titled Against All Odds, The Terence Whitmore Story, became a cultural touchstone, earning awards and sparking discussions about justice and resilience. Despite the widespread recognition, those closest to Terence knew that his true legacy lay not in the accolades but in the lives he had touched. Alana, who had become a leading figure in the fight for civil rights, often visited his grave, seeking inspiration and reflecting on his enduring influence. One such visit came on a quiet autumn morning. Standing before his headstone, she spoke softly, as though he could hear her. "We're still fighting, Terence," she said. "The work is hard, but we're making progress. And every step we take is because you showed us it was possible. Thank you for everything." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying her words into the distance. Terence Whitmore's story became a touchstone for generations, a reminder that change is possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. His life was proof that courage, determination, and the belief in a better world could overcome even the most entrenched systems of injustice. And as his legacy continued to inspire, the world he fought for came closer to becoming a reality. As the decades passed, Terence Whitmore's name became synonymous with the broader civil rights movement of the 21st century. Monuments, scholarships, and initiatives were named in his honor, but the most enduring tribute was the spirit of activism he had inspired. The community center in Oakland, now expanded to multiple locations across the city, continued to thrive. Programs there evolved with the times, addressing not only systemic racism but also new challenges such as climate justice, digital equity, and economic disparities. It became a model replicated in cities nationwide, its roots firmly grounded in the principles Terence had championed: equality, accountability, and collective action. Alana Hayes, now a nationally recognized leader, spearheaded a foundation named after her mentor. The Whitmore Justice Foundation focused on providing resources to underfunded legal defense teams, supporting whistleblowers, and advocating for legislative reforms. Under Alana's leadership, the foundation tackled some of the most pressing issues of the day, from prison reform to voting rights. The foundation also established an annual Whitmore Legacy Summit, bringing together activists, lawmakers, educators, and community leaders to collaborate on actionable solutions for justice. The summit's keynote address was always delivered by someone whose life had been profoundly shaped by Terrence's legacy. These speakers, whether young activists or seasoned advocates, shared personal stories of transformation and empowerment. One year, the keynote was delivered by a teenager named Jaden, who had grown up in Oakland's most underprivileged neighborhood. Jaden had participated in the center's youth programs, where he discovered his passion for writing and storytelling. Standing before a packed audience, he recounted how learning about Terrence's life had inspired him to believe in his own potential. "Terrence Whitmore didn't just fight for justice," Jaden said. "He fought for all of us, for our right to dream, to thrive, to live without fear. He made me believe that no matter where I come from, I have a voice. And that voice can change the world." Jaden's speech went viral, reaching millions of viewers and sparking a wave of renewed interest in the principles Terrence had stood for. Meanwhile, in Oakland, the annual Day of Justice grew into a week-long celebration, featuring workshops, panel discussions, art exhibits, and community service projects. Local artists painted murals depicting key moments from Terrence's life, each one telling a story of resistance, resilience, and triumph. These murals became landmarks, symbols of the city's transformation and its ongoing commitment to justice. In schools, children learned about Terrence not just as a historical figure but as a source of inspiration for their own lives. His story was included in textbooks alongside those of Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X. Teachers emphasized the importance of ordinary people standing up against extraordinary challenges and the power of community in driving change. One particularly moving tribute came during the unveiling of a new curriculum titled Whitmore's Path, a guide to justice and leadership. Developed in collaboration with educators, activists, and the Whitmore Justice Foundation, the curriculum aimed to teach students about systemic injustice, critical thinking, and the tools for effective advocacy. At the launch event, a teacher from Oakland's public school system shared how Terrence's story had impacted her students. "When I told my class about Terrence Whitmore, one of my students, a boy who rarely speaks up, raised his hand and said, 'If he could do all that, maybe I can too.' That's the power of his legacy. He shows our kids that they are capable of greatness, no matter the obstacles." As the world continued to evolve, the principles Terrence had fought for remained as relevant as ever. His life served as a reminder that while progress requires persistence, it also demands hope and unity. In the quiet moments, those who knew Terrence best, his family, friends, and the many people he had mentored, would reflect on the man behind the movement. They remembered his warmth, his humility, and his unwavering belief in the power of individuals to create change. One day, Alana visited the statue of Terrence in downtown Oakland. She placed a hand on the base of the statue, her thoughts drifting to everything they had achieved and everything that lay ahead. "We're still pushing," she said softly. "Still carrying the torch. I hope we're making you proud." The wind blew gently through the streets, as if answering her words. The story of Terrence Whitmore became a touchstone for all who believed in justice and equality. It reminded the world that one voice, one act of courage, could ignite a movement. And as long as people continued to fight for what was right, his legacy would endure, a beacon of hope lighting the path toward a better future.